Okay, let's just dive right in. Few topics stir up as much debate and, honestly, as much genuine confusion as the role of women in the Bible. It feels like on one hand, you have these powerful stories of female leaders, but on the other, you have these verses that seem to command silence. So today, we're going to take a journey into the surprising context behind it all.
And this, right here, is the central question, isn't it? It feels like you can pull out a verse to support just about any position you want, which, well, it leads to this feeling of a deep contradiction sitting right at the heart of the text. And that's exactly the problem we're going to explore. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because it reframes the whole issue. So often, we think the tension is between our modern 21st century values and this ancient, outdated world. But the scholar whose work we're looking at today says, nope, that's not actually it. The real conflict is inside the biblical data itself. You've got a couple of really restrictive texts standing against, well, a mountain of evidence to the contrary. So the real conflict isn't us versus the Bible, it's the Bible versus the Bible. So where do we even begin to untangle this? Well, according to the evidence, you have to start with Jesus. His actions, his teachings, they set the entire trajectory for the New Testament. And what he did for his time was nothing short of revolutionary. To really get how radical Jesus was, you first have to understand the world he walked into. This quote right here from the Jewish sage Ben Sirach, it's pretty jarring to read, but it perfectly captures the deeply patriarchal view of the time. And look, this wasn't some fringe opinion. This was the cultural wallpaper. It was just the air people breathed. And it wasn't just, a bad attitude. It had real-world legal consequences. A woman couldn't even testify in court because her word was literally considered valueless. And the highest spiritual calling for a Jewish person, studying the scriptures, the Torah, was completely and strictly off limits to her. And bam, this is the contrast. Into that world walks Jesus. So when Mary of Bethany sits at his feet to learn, an act that was reserved exclusively for male disciples, her sister, Martha, objects. And what does Jesus do? He doesn't just defend Mary. He declares her choice to learn is the better part, and that it will never be taken away from her. I mean, he was fundamentally changing the rules of the game right then and there. And this new trajectory, this new path, it didn't just end with Jesus. It became the blueprint for the entire early church. I mean, when the Holy Spirit comes at Pentecost, who does it fall on? It falls on both men and women, empowering all of them for ministry. And the evidence for this is it's all over the New Testament, especially in Paul's letters. You've got Priscilla, who taught the great teacher Apollos. You've got Phoebe, who Paul calls a diakonos, a minister, which is the exact same word he uses for himself. You have Lydia and Nympha, who led entire churches that met in their homes. And then there's Junia, who Paul says is an outstanding apostle. These aren't just followers, folks. They are leaders, plain and simple. In fact, get this, the evidence of female leadership was so undeniable and so challenging to later cultural norms that some scribes literally changed the text. The perfectly normal female name Junia was twisted into the non-existent male name Junius. The female leader Nympha became the male leader Nymphus. They actually rewrote history because the reality of women in charge was just too much for them to handle. Okay, I know what you might be thinking. What about that famous verse that seems to contradict, well, all of this? This brings us to a really fascinating textual mystery in Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And you guys, this one could change everything. And there it is. For centuries, this verse has been the go-to text, the primary argument that women should not speak or lead in the church. It seems incredibly direct, unambiguous even. This is the startling question that modern textual criticism now forces us to ask. Based on the evidence we have from the oldest manuscripts, many scholars now believe these two verses were actually not part of Paul's original, inspired letter at all. So why the doubt? Well, textual scholars point to some huge clues. First, in our oldest manuscripts, these verses literally jump around. Sometimes they're here, sometimes they're at the end of the chapter. That's a classic sign of a later note someone added in the margins. It also flatly contradicts what Paul says just a few chapters earlier, in chapter 11, where he told women how to prophesy in church, not that they should be silent. And what's really amazing is that if you just remove those two verses, Paul's original argument flows perfectly. So the conclusion a lot of scholars have reached is that this was likely a scribe's personal note that just accidentally got copied into the main text over time. So if the 1 Corinthians passage was probably a later addition, what about the other major restrictive text, the one in 1 Timothy chapter 2?
Well, here, the key isn't about textual history. It's all about understanding a very specific, very local crises that Paul was trying to solve.
See, Paul didn't write First Timothy to be some kind of general church manual for all time. He wrote it to his protege Timothy for one main reason: to help him stop a group of false teachers who were just wreaking havoc in the church there in Ephesus.
And the source of the problem was very, very specific. According to the letter, these false teachers were targeting and deceiving a particular group of women, most likely wealthy, influential women, who were then using their social networks to spread this dangerous heresy from house to house.
And this is why Paul brings up Adam and Eve. It's so easy to misunderstand this. His point isn't about the order of creation or setting up some kind of timeless male hierarchy. His focus, his main point, is all about deception. He's making a parallel. He's saying, just like Eve was deceived in the garden, these specific women in your church in Ephesus are being deceived right now by these false teachers.
So when you put all of that together, you realize Paul's instructions weren't a universal command for all women. It was a practical, temporary solution for a local problem. Telling these specific women to learn in quietness was a strategy to stop them from spreading the heresy while they were being properly taught. The advice to marry and manage their homes, that was a pragmatic way to redirect their energy and get them away from the influence of these predatory teachers. It was never intended as a universal rule for all women, everywhere, for all time. And all of this brings us to the final takeaway from this whole deep dive. When you look at the cultural context, Jesus' actions, the clear evidence of leadership in the early church, and the textual history, a very different picture emerges. And it all leads to this powerful concluding question, a question that's rooted in the experience of the early church itself. If God, through the Holy Spirit, gives spiritual gifts from ministry to both men and women, then who are we to stand in God's way?